Good afternoon, everyone. How is everybody doing? Great. Okay. My name's Alex Barna, and as many of you know, I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at the University of Chicago. I am happy to introduce our final journalist this afternoon, Kathryn Zoff. Kathryn is a fellow at New America. Her first book, Excellent Daughters: The Secret Lives of Young Women Who Are Transforming the Arab World, was published by the Penguin Press in 2016. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, New York Observer, International Herald Tribune, The Chronicle of Higher Education, The New York Times Magazine, and elsewhere. Today, she will share her presentation, Women's Voices from Saudi Arabia, and then she will be leading our reporting workshop. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Zoff.
Thank you all so much for having me. So Fareed mentioned just before we broke for lunch that you all would be working on coming up with your own story ideas. How is that going? Does anybody have an idea already, or are you still working on it? Before we go into the yes, doing our workshop. So. And I'll talk a little bit about how I sort of try to accomplish these things in my own work. So we've got a map of Saudi Arabia here. I just wanted to ask, so just briefly, so what are some things that you guys, you know a lot. We spoke earlier, so you know a great deal about Saudi Arabia. But has anyone else been to Saudi Arabia or spent time there? So what are some things that I guess, what are some of the reasons that Saudi Arabia gets so much attention in the American and the Western press relative to other countries of its size and population? Why is it important?
Yes. Oil?
Yeah. Yes. Any other reasons? That's great.
The relationship between the Bushes and the royal family?
That's one very reason, yes.
I think it's also because of the Israel thing. I mean, they want the Israel conflict with the other neighbors, something like that. Maybe Saudi has something to do with Israel. Saudi is in good terms with the U.S. They will also protect the other countries.
Yes.
I guess Saudi Arabia kind of represents the contradictions in American foreign policy. I mean, it's like on one hand, we talk about championing democratic rights, but Saudi Arabia doesn't.
No, exactly. It puts us right up against some of the kind of contradictory aspects of our values. Yes.
For anybody who's involved in feminist issues, we know it is the most repressive and least participatory for women.
Yeah, or it's certainly maybe the developed countries. Yes, it's pretty. Anybody? You probably, maybe you can tell. So anyone know one of the the sort of monikers for the king of Saudi Arabia? Do anyone know what he's called within the kingdom? You wanna?
He's the
custodian.
The custodian of the two holy.
Okay. Anyone know where the two holy mosques are? So Mecca and Medina. Basically. In addition to all these reasons that were named, Saudi Arabia, it's sort of the spiritual home of Islam, which is, as you all know, one of the world's major religions. So I think that's the one I would add to this. It's very, very important because it is seen by many, many millions of Muslims worldwide as it's a place where you aspire to go if you are able to make a pilgrimage sometime in your life. It's whether or not you agree with the. Can you all hear me?
No, you're good.
Whether or not you agree with the way Islam is practiced there, you certainly have an opinion about it. Mecca and Medina, they are not on this map. Oh yeah, here they are. So that Medina is there and Mecca's here. Yeah. So and here's Jeddah, and so Mecca and then Medina. So I'm going to just show. So So I've done 2 stories in Saudi Arabia with the Pulitzer Center, and I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times sort of before that, not with the Pulitzer Center. So, you brought up I'm sorry, we met before, I don't remember your name, but you brought up the issue of women's rights, and several of the stories that I have reported, actually all of the stories that I have, all but one of the stories I've ended up reporting from Saudi Arabia over the last decade have had to do in some way with women's rights. So, which is, if you talk to most Saudis, I don't know that many of them would agree that this is the most important issue, but it is certainly one of the most important issues for Westerners as they look at the kingdom. So I wanted to go on, sorry, I want to make sure, oh, here we go, here's the next slide. So so you all are teachers, so this is, does anybody here read Arabic? You do? Yeah, do you want to tell it? Can you make it out? So this is a pamphlet that's handed out in girls' schools, sort of some educational material.
So it's something that, something about paradise?
Paradise, exactly. So this is, can you, how would you interpret this, just looking at this quickly?
I think it has to do with how you should and shouldn't wear your hijab in your
Yeah.
What is it?
It's about it's about basically so these are all, they're X's, I don't know if you can see, there are red X's underneath to show that these are these very immodest ways of wearing your hijab and niqab. These are wrong, these are immodest, and this is the correct way, and it's saying that, it's actually saying that women who wear their hijabs, who cover themselves like this, will not reach paradise, nor will they even be able to smell its scent, basically. Sorry, I wanted to show this at first, because this is sort of, it gives you a sense of sort of like the normal, the way girls are sort of brought up. This is a pretty common, like, kind of public school lesson that girls would get starting around the age of 9, is when you have to start covering your face as part of your school uniform. And in this photo, you can actually see the outline of some hair. You can see that she's got a bun here, and here you can see that she's got piled her hair on top of her head. Here you can see some hair in back. They all sort of suggest some kind of complicated hairstyle going on underneath, and this one does not. I actually, when I've given presentations with the Pulitzer Center to middle and high schools, this has always gotten a lot of reactions from the students. So I thought it was maybe an interesting one to show, to show you all, because I think a lot of times young people who are still living under parental supervision and who are still, sort of maybe chafing against the restrictions in their schools and communities, they have a really sort of very interesting reactions to the idea that women never outgrow these restrictions. Basically, that young people can look forward at the age of 18, or or whenever they're financially independent from their families, outgrowing these. And Saudi Arabia is a country where women all their lives essentially have the legal status of minors, of children. For an unmarried woman, this is typically your father. For a married woman, this is typically your husband, who's your guardian. And I mean, is there anything you would like to add to this? Oh no, I was just going to say, please chip in if you have any. Anyway, I just wanted to start with this, just because I think it's a way that of talking about the kingdom that I've found really gets students engaged when they kind of think about what that would be like, and and also. The role, the relationship of, that girls have to their brothers and fathers. conversation that I had with a lot of, young Saudi women about, their younger brothers checking up on their, checking their phones and checking their Facebook pages and sort of monitoring their behavior in certain ways. And it's something that feels very sort of unfamiliar and that I think they tend to find really sort of interesting as a sort of starting point. So the stories, okay, so this is moving on. So the first story I reported with the help from the
Yeah, and I was just going to say one thing really quickly about that, just as a caveat, because one thing I find my students find really frustrating when you're trying to learn about a new part of the world, you want to be able to say these sort of definitive things about them.
Yeah.
And it's so true, and we need to do it because we're trying to organize the stuff in our minds. But I try and convince them too that just like any other place, that there's a lot of diversity according to region within Saudi Arabia and sort of how people wear it, what's expected of them. And so much depends, being a woman in Saudi Arabia, like almost everything depends on who your father is.
Exactly.
So you can live a completely different, awesome life if you have a father who's really liberal and in the private sphere, you live amongst other people. There are even like beach properties where like families get together and everyone goes around their bikini, and there's these fissures, these weird moments and things that happen that you wouldn't expect to be able to have happen, that happen there.
So I'm just, so up until now, I've just been talking about like what is the standard, state mandated curriculum. This is, what is this? What are the standard laws? But yes, within basically everything you have in your life, all the opportunities you have available to you as a Saudi woman, it depends on the character of your guardian, whether that's your father or your husband, and so this isn't to say that many Saudi women, are, perhaps even most, feel like they have all the opportunities they would like in their life. Yes, go on.
No, I'm sorry, but I'm just saying, I think that when you want to say it's oppressive, it is. Like, it still is, though, because it's kind of like saying, well, some people had really nice slave masters. Like, yeah, well, that's true. And yet, still, the condition of being a slave, is awful, and they can change based on whether or not your father dies or whoever your next person. It wasn't really a caveat to what you were saying. It's just kind of just in general, as we're, like, kind of taking it in when we want to say these kind of things about Saudi. Like, it's true, and some people would say that they're not, but you don't have to recognize your oppression.
This is something that I come up against a lot when I'm talking about my reporting in the Middle East. It's a region of the world with very sort of weak traditions of individual rights, where rights are conceived of as something that belongs to the community, the society. So, on an individual level, people don't tend to sort of see their rights in quite the same way that we do. And they often don't see anything wrong with systems that we can't, we would be very, very offended by. And things are designed around what would protect the community overall, like the laws, the structures, or you find often that, so when you go to Saudi Arabia and you ask questions about women's rights, most women don't want to talk about it. Like 95% of the women you meet don't want to talk about it. They'll sort of say, well, I have a driver, or my father is kind and he gives me whatever I want, or my brothers drive me to my and I would argue that yes, most families anywhere in the world are loving and functional, and but the problems come when you if you have a father who doesn't provide those things, you have no structures that protect you. You have no shelters. You have no public recourse to change your guardian, to assert your rights as an individual. So our society, on the other hand, is constructed around the idea that every last person, needs to have their rights protected. We organize our society around protecting every last individual's rights rather than looking at the big group. Yes, go on.
In other words, these women internalize the traditional values of our society and the maternal type. And it's okay, quote unquote, for them to be subjected to the male figures. And then I would ask you, maybe that's what I think. And then I would ask them, all the values that the Western.
They know quite a lot about the West. They have Western media, they watch Western television shows. They're much more exposed to our ways of life than we are to theirs. And by and large, in my experience, they don't envy it. This is not something they want for themselves. It's something that they know any more than we would like this in our lives. And part of this, I have to say, I think it's because it is when you're in a society where everything you have in your life, I mean, okay, just to take a step back. So say you're a 16-year-old girl in Saudi Arabia, or in Syria for that matter, you want to go to university, and your family is not inclined to let you. Well, what's the best way to achieve your goals? Is it going to be to like fight with your family and rail and you know, talk about your rights and feminism, or could it possibly be, you know, there aren't any institutions that'll protect you. There's no way you can emancipate yourself. There are no scholarships. If your family doesn't want to pay for you to attend or support you, there's nothing you can do. Is it maybe to become very, very devout? To start wearing the niqab when the other women in your family perhaps only wear the hijab, and to convince your family that you are the daughter that should be trusted, that you subtly sort of talk to your family about perhaps delaying marriage while you get your master's degree, or while you perhaps just for a few years until you finish your first degree. Like it's like you have to put yourself into the shoes of someone who's actually living in that context and has no. I sometimes think we conceive of rebellion as a sort of natural thing, we think of, I sometimes think like rebellion is a sort of natural adolescent phase in a society where to be an adult means to think for yourself, to vote, to live independently. In a society where adulthood does not mean those things, the sort of rights of adolescence look very, very different. I mean, in Saudi, you hear a lot of, I've spent much more time with young women than young men, but they often will joke about the younger brother going through his religious phase, and he's just going around and he's burning everybody's music, and he's, deleting people's, and he's checking everybody's phones, and he's waking everybody up at 5 a.m. so they can, that's sort of a way of asserting your power within the family. It's a way of sort of asserting your independence, your status within the family, in the same way that maybe an adolescent in the West might accomplish, in other ways. Is this making sense? I feel like I'm trying to explain sort of very quickly like how, like one of the things I'm always trying to sort of help my students kind of figure out how to look at is not just what do the issues look like from our perspective, but what does it feel like to live them when you're in that context? And it's a much harder thing. I'm sorry?
Are you saying that the women in Saudi are satisfied with what they have right now? I mean, they don't complain?
I'd say 95% of the women I've interviewed would say yes. And partly that's about money. To be very honest, this is something that very few journalists talk about, and it's something that's really, really uncomfortable, but it's a society, Qatar, the Emirates, these are societies where the standard of living is very, very, very high. And every time I go there, I am, by and large, interviewing women who, though they don't have the same rights as I, have a standard of, they live in a way that I don't know anyone who lives, who lives in a
In other words, they have found that they're survival kits. So they have found the ways to survive and to use the brain.
I don't even think it's like survival. I think it's just in some sense. Yeah, but I don't think that they even think of it in that they don't think of it as calculating, because when you are part of that society, you just think about it as love, honestly. Maybe you think about it as this is my family, and you work, in different ways. Is it? Yes.
I think also we should add that, there are a lot of Saudi feminist movements, like Women to Drive.
There are, but they are almost unknown there.
So a lot of some of my students have actually presented on this.
Yeah.
They also have read Girls of Riyadh by Raja Aslan, the
Yeah.
novel. And they were really affected by some of the lives, how the Saudi women's lives are so actually similar to their own lives in the way that the things they want, the things they look for. So I think it's a little bit maybe simplistic to look at it in the way that, that is their reality and that is what they, what they have come to know. I mean, I think there's a
I think
change.
it's also simplistic to sort of look at it and say they must want what we think they want. I mean, I don't think most of them do want to drive. In fact, it's just not really a public debate. I mean, this is something that I have really a lot of trouble explaining to editors because I'm always sort of sent sort of with this idea of like reporting on the state of the debate over women's rights. There is no public debate on women's rights effectively. Really, very little. A little bit on social media, but there's a lot of fear. Yes, go.
Two things that complicate this is one is that there's such a difference of the private versus public
That's
in
what
Saudi
I was
Arabia.
asking.
And so your public life in that persona and people acknowledging it that way, that you're walking through space, like sort of owning it in this certain way, it's just not important, but it's not as important even to men in Saudi Arabia, right? So there's your public life, there's your private life, and if your private life, you can assert yourself in ways that you can't imagine in public. And we would still see that oppressive, and whether or not it's oppressive or not, I think is probably interesting, but like very complex, but like, and then I think the other is that when women in Saudi face a lot of the same considerations that other women of color face, which is that when someone's asking them outside of their culture what they're doing, the tendency is to want to defend the culture because they think it could be used to further oppress the culture and say, like, your culture created this patriarchal, like, sort of situation you're in. So it's always, it takes a lot of time for people to really sort of share with you the real insights of how they're feeling about their opportunities or lack of opportunities. But, when my students look at these images at first, they're sort of like, my God, that's so like, that I'd have to walk through space and dress like that. And I tell it's like, but you don't understand, like, that's what you grow up in. Like, so little girls love to like put on an abaya because that's what inspired she was growing up as a woman. You see them in the mall with
Talk to mothers about like how their daughters have been begging them since the age of 4 or 5 to wear it, and like when are they going to allow them to do this?
And when they look at girls here who are wearing like, and no offense if anybody has this, but like wearing sweatpants with juicy written on their butt, they're sort of like, oh my God, that's so horrifying and oppressive, and like, and so it's just, but our girls, it's like, that's the choices. You go to Forever 21 and these are the choices you have. You go there, and there's all kinds of, like, I was trying to do, like, I saw people with abayas. I lived there for quite a while and taught there, but like, people, you could buy an abaya with a skull and crossbones and rhinestones on the back. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you personalize the same way.
Even in Dubai, they have designer abaya shops, where you can go in and get and shop for just really exquisite fabric.
And they're beautiful.
Dark colors, and they're beautiful. And you see the women, fully covered. They've got false eyelashes a mile long. That's about the only thing you see is their eyes, but you look at their feet and they've got jewel encrusted sandals that they're wearing, while their spouses are in wife beater t-shirts and a pair of shorts, and all of their children are dressed in very, very Western clothing. The women are covered from head to toe, and it's like, that their life, once they get home, is very, very different than the perceptions that we have as outsiders. I think that it's difficult for us to kind of perceive that.
And I'm trying to cover a lot of ground really quickly and kind of give a general sense of like some of the strictures that women live under there, because I'm about to discuss, these 2 stories I've done for the Pulitzer Center, which were looking at changes, sort of like little cracks in this sort of edifice of rules. And so the first of these was I went in October, November of 2013 to report on the emergence of Saudi women into retail jobs for the first time. This was something that was incredibly controversial. Saudi women don't work in the public space or hadn't for many, many years. And it's also a story that, actually the editor had come to me, and I had some doubts as to whether a few hundred Saudi women working in lingerie shops was really changing things. And it's one where I was really, I left feeling just incredibly optimistic about the sort of knock-on effect that these of just women having leaving the house. You know, many of the women I interviewed for these stories had been, the typical story was I married at 14, and then I was divorced at 25, and I raised my 4 kids, and I've been living in my father's house, and I haven't really left home except for maybe once or twice a year, you know, on holidays. And now I'm going to get a job, and now I'm meeting other divorced women for the first time, and I'm discovering that, you know, that they have the right to see their children, and I'm going to sort of, it was really interesting, and you know, they were talking about their shame when the religious police would come and accost them and yell at them, but then the way they would defend themselves and each other. There was this real sort of sense of kind of almost like emerging class consciousness of, you know, emerging sense of themselves as you know, as sort of working women. So I'm just going to show a few of these pictures. Does anybody has anybody followed this debate? I'm sure you have. So what, can you tell us why were lingerie shops, you know, the first place, the first, you know, sort of public place where Saudi women could work?
Because it's so complex having men do it.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a kind of the brainwave of actually a Saudi business school professor named Reem Assad, and she had a sort of humiliating experience one day shopping for underwear, and there was a male employee in a store in Jeddah who sort of insisted on kind of telling her, no, you need a larger size than that, and holding up like larger and larger size pairs of underpants. And she was not very happy with that, and she went onto Facebook when she got home and was like, men should not be working. We are one of the sort of the most dignified conservative societies in the world, and it's ridiculous that we have men humiliating us in these lingerie shops, and women should have the right. It took about 4 years of campaigning, and she gathered thousands of signatures, and she got some support from a very forward-looking Minister of Labor. But eventually in 2012, the Saudi Labor Ministry started allowing women to work in lingerie shops, and then, you know, very slowly, a few months later, once people were a little bit comfortable with women working in lingerie shops, it was, you know, women could get jobs in supermarkets, and there were makeup stores, and suddenly, you know, it's still, you know, even today, you know, 5 years later, it's still pretty limited to stores which have a predominantly female clientele, but there are jobs, and it's a sort of, it's provided economic opportunities for a class of Saudi women who really have had scarcely any opportunities outside the home. You know, so yes?
Is it not because of economics? I mean, half of the population needs to work.
I'm sorry?
Is it because of economics? We know for a fact that Saudi is having some problems economically.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so there's always been a sort of, so for a couple of generations it's been possible to go to Saudi Arabia and meet female surgeons and female, you know, but outside of medicine and teaching, there have been very, very few jobs of any kind for women, really very few. And this was because in order to employ women, a workplace needs to be able to provide an environment where the women will never see or speak to a male colleague and yet can work with them. And so they have to have means of like inter-office communication, usually a separate entrance. It needs to be a large enough office with a sort of infrastructure to kind of keep the women separate and sort of provide for their, you know, sort of make sure that their modesty is protected. And there are pretty few, you know, girls' schools sort of naturally provide that, and hospitals, you know, have sections where that can be done. But it's generally, you know, for a long time, it's only been the sort of largest, you know, kind of public institutions that have been able to do that. So yeah, I mean, it was just a very, very clever campaign focused on using a kind of culturally acceptable idea. You know, women need to be able to buy these private things in private. You know, it doesn't seem very, this was something that even very conservative Saudis could get behind. And it just offered a little chink that has ended up, you know, offering jobs for a segment of Saudi society which really didn't have very many opportunities of, of any kind. And did anybody have questions? I'm just going to quickly go through these photographs. I mean, I'm just showing these photographs because I think they're, my friend Kate Brooks, who came with me, the Pulitzer Center sent her along with me to report this story. I think she just does such beautiful work. So I wanted to show you some of these things. And this is the blonde woman in the center. This is one of the sales ladies herself. And she was a real firecracker. She was one of my favorite characters in this story. And she shocked all of us by just saying, "Oh, sure, I'll demonstrate." And she whipped off her niqab, and she's sort of beautiful blonde underneath, and kind of just posed while her friends, her fellow saleswomen, did her makeup. And I interviewed her several times for this piece, and she was talking about she was still married. I would say about 80% of the women who were among the first cohort to take these jobs were divorcees. But she was still married, and she had found that even though she was earning a pretty low salary, she said, my husband's afraid of me now. He doesn't feel like he can abuse me. He knows I can earn my, she felt like just having this little extra bit of, she was only working 2 or 3 days a week, but she felt like having this extra income had given her a little added status within the household, and it had enabled her to kind of argue for, no, I want my children to be taking those lessons instead of these lessons, or just these little things that didn't necessarily mean a lot in a sort of global sense, but for her and for her sense of pride and her sense of her own possibilities really was hugely meaningful. So I thought she was a kind of a fantastic character. Anybody have any questions?
She could take her. There was alcohol, regardless of there were no men around.
Yes, and she was also sort of betting on the fact that this story wasn't really going to be seen within the kingdom. Also, this is something, actually, when I went back, this is something the New Yorker and I had a kind of a long talk about, because there's often this question of, you want to protect sources, and sometimes a source will see a foreign journalist and they'll want to pour out their heart because they think, well, no one I know will ever hear this story or will ever hear what I said, and sometimes there's not a really sort of much of an understanding of kind of the global reach of, some, American publications in this globalized, sort of internet era, the internet. So we had a long talk with her. The fact checkers from the New Yorker called her, and we sort of made sure that, in fact, there were not going to be, really sort of, there wasn't going to be any sort of retribution. That this was something she was in fact comfortable with. But yes, no, it's a good question. Anyone else? Let's see. So we're 5 minutes ahead. Okay. So let's see here. So these are, this was actually very interesting. This was in sort of Harvey, another of my favorite characters in this story. Do you all know who Prince Bandar was? Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. For well over 20 years, right? It was during the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, sort of into the Clinton administration. His daughter, Princess Rima, his oldest daughter, who grew up in Virginia, D.C. and went to women's college in Virginia, has moved back to Saudi Arabia with her family, and she is the general manager of Harvey Nichols Riyadh now, and she's very Americanized in her taste, but she has a very, very interesting perspectives on, how far Saudi society can be pushed. We had some really interesting conversations about, because she grew up in the States, like most of us did here. She understands sort of the way things may appear to foreigners, but she also sort of is very protective of Saudi society and Saudi values, and there are things that she will push, and there are things that she just won't do. Like music in the stores is something that she just is anathema. This is something that is just too shocking. So stores have complete silence. She talked also about the importance of being very respectful when the religious police come in with their canes and they start shouting at women, that you're you're a wanton woman, you should cover up, you know, if you come back tomorrow, we'll take you to jail. She talks about the importance of confronting them, you know, with dignity and politeness and sort of taking their advice reasonably and sort of saying, thank you for your opinion. You know, she said she had one incident where, you know, there was a woman, like this makeover scene, the women had been doing each other's makeup during a slow moment at the makeup counter, and one woman had this sort of green glittery eye makeup on that you could see through the slit in her niqab, and of course the religious police had a field day over that, and she advised this woman, you know, this is not the time to stand up for feminism, this is a time to sort of say, I'm so sorry, thank you for your opinion, and to wipe it off right then and there. Yeah, it was really interesting because she, there were, you know, I think perhaps as a reporter, I kind of maybe wanted her to go a little farther than she was willing to go, but she would explain very cogently and very sort of fluently why a more moderate, sort of respectful approach was actually more likely to get her what she wanted in the end. So I thought she was very interesting.
Anyone?
I have a question. So what's going on? Is she making a request to show me that one right there?
Yes, exactly. You know, this is actually no, this is a saleswoman there, because I remember interviewing her. This, I believe, is a customer who's holding out the shoe, and she's saying, you know, we've got our sale rack behind you, or something along those lines.
Oh, they wear this under their scarf. These shoes.
Oh yes, yeah. No, this is yes, and shoes and bags are really big thing there because they're the one, you know, the only things that you can see. Yes, yeah. I mean, this is something. I mean, this is a weird thing to talk about, but again, you know, I was you know, interviewing women who had lives which I did not envy because they were so, you know, they didn't have the opportunities I had, but yet they were wearing like $5,000 worth of shoes and handbags, and you know, and were driven around by their private driver and went on vacation, you know, in the south of France for 3 months every year. You know, it's a really complicated thing, sort of these kinds of like. You know, and something I was never sure quite how to deal with, because it's hard, you know, from afar. It's easy to sort of feel pity, but then you go and you know, sometimes you feel something like envy as well. It's really complicated, and it's just, you know, I think the longer you spend sort of reporting overseas, the more complicated it gets, because you're not just sort of diving in with your foreigner's perspective. You've come to sort of see how life looks from a different place, which is, I think, always should be our goal, you know, in our reporting. Yes.
Well, the complexities of feminism and, you know, being a French teacher with the burqa ban, and the assumption that women who were, you know, the French government making the assumption that women who are, you know, in burqas, you know, are oppressed, whereas the women themselves, just like Saudi women, you know, when I said, you know, when I first started saying that that's what we know of Saudi about oppression, I wasn't meaning from the Saudi women's perspective. I was talking from the American media's perspective. Right, but you're talking about the woman who went back, this royalty who then went back, chose to go back. Chose to go back. Yeah, right. Absolutely. So I mean, it's very easy for students to understand. Yeah, not using our Western, you know, values, saying, wouldn't they all love to have what we have? Not at all, and it's very powerful for them to hear about this woman. I'll try to get more information from her on this royalty that went back, but also women who choose to wear the.
She's a really interesting woman. She's actually now, so Saudi Arabia has been under some pressure to start sending women to the Olympic Games, and they sent a few in the last Olympic Games. She's now the head of like the women's section of the Saudi Olympic Committee. She's a new job. She's moved on from Harvey Nichols Riyadh. But just as sort of a side note, I had a very interesting discussion with a Saudi feminist and an Egyptian feminist about makeup, which they see as kind of worse than the niqab. It's your, why do you kind of in the West complain about us covering with a simple piece of cloth that's comfortable and breathable, and you're spending, hours a day lacquering yourself and putting on blush and mascara? Isn't that the same thing? Your society doesn't want to see the true face of a woman either. And I found myself very okay, yeah. Yeah. So, any other questions before we take a quick break, and then, yeah.
Are there any more slides?
Yes, there are a couple. I mean, they're all, yeah. Oh, so these are fun. This is after time, so women started working in supermarket checkouts as well. But they can only work in lines where they're serving other women. So you see these signs that say for family only, and it's showing, that these are checkout lines that single men shouldn't go to.
I mean, there's a store, they're still mingling, it's just only when they check.
It's the interaction is the important thing. It's because you would be speaking to the checkout clerk and handing over your credit card, or, yeah. But good question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I had, I've heard that there were also none of them rich in Saudi Arabia.
No, of course.
And so I guess you've been talking mainly about the wealthy, and I'm wondering, did you interview some of the lower class?
Of course, yes. Yeah, yes, of course. But it's also the lines of wealth they're just drawn a bit differently. Like the poorest Saudis I interviewed, and these were people who had no furniture in their houses, just, some plastic mats on the floor, had servants doing their cooking and their cleaning for them, and I remember, one Saudi friend sort of who is regarded as having come from a very, very poor family, was telling me about the sort of deprivations of her harsh childhood, and her family only had one maid who came for 12 hours every single day except Friday, but she didn't live in. And so her mother occasionally had to cook a meal. And this was sort of, there is poverty, but it's sometimes, it's not something that we, recognize as
Saudi, I think, living in Saudi Arabia doesn't make you Saudi, right?
Who are those?
So we're talking about Saudi. We're talking about Saudis here. We're talking about Saudi citizens here. Saudi Arabia is not a country that gives citizenship to immigrants who have been there for any length of time. So yes. So we're talking about Saudi citizens here. Yes.
The poorest of all, the Vietnamese. That has to be.
Yes, that's an interesting topic, and it's something that is not even really talked about when we talk about Saudi poverty, because they do not consider them. This is actually something that Kathleen and I had a really interesting discussion about before, because servants, maids, drivers are sort of they're unofficial but sort of widely tolerated exceptions to this rule against gender mingling. So a man who has his breakfast served by a Filipino housemaid or a woman who is in a car with her Sri Lankan driver are not seen as consorting with the opposite sex. They're just, it's a very sort of convenient loophole. But yes, it raises a lot of questions about, very uncomfortable questions about race and class. And because, for example, the Filipino ambassador and his wife would absolutely be held in the category. They would be, if you could not be in a room alone with them, or, if it would be gender. But if they're if they're both foreign and poor and in a serving capacity, they're seen as sort of, okay, well, we don't really count that. It's very, very interesting.
That's another reason why women were so successful in getting the jobs in lingerie shops. It's because those weren't Saudi men who were working in those stores before. They don't work menial jobs like that. Those were foreign men. So they were from the Philippines, from Bangladesh, from India. And so that was also what made it more repugnant, right? If these men they felt that kind of shame with these foreign men.
There are lots of really uncomfortable questions. So yes, like this, and this was something that was played up in the campaign. It's just these foreign men. I cope with a man from Pakistan holding up like large, extra large sized, underpants. This was part of it, and it was really uncomfortable for me, sort of, because on one hand I agreed with her that women should have these jobs, but on the other hand there was a group of people that were all going to be unemployed immediately and kicked out of the country, going to lose their jobs and their homes, like out of stroke if these women got jobs. So, yeah, these are some of the sort of, yeah.
It's just the same economic argument that gets made against women driving, which is that a whole lot of men who are foreign workers will be sent out of the country and not be able to provide for their families.
You know, the sort of the, you know, sort of my closest Saudi friends, this is something that they'll talk about pretty often is just their discomfort about the fact that everything they've achieved in their lives, you know, their ability to have 5 children and a career, and, you know, it is because they have, you know, maids and servants, you know, people who take care of their grocery shopping and their cooking and their childcare and everything else. And I admire them for acknowledging it. I think as the country develops and, you know, particularly if they become, you know, if the government becomes more open to sort of global human rights, you know, norms, I think these are going to be major questions. But right now, you know, when you know, we as Western reporters like sort of look at Saudi, we're typically talking about Saudi citizens. Yes.
Yeah, this was your main story, right?
This was in 2013.
Yeah. We inherited Saudi, they call it Saudization. They term it as Saudization, meaning...
Saudization, yes,
Yeah.
that's correct, yes.
I mean, what would happen to these jobs? I mean, more women are accepted now?
I wouldn't say that there are a huge number more than, but yes, the idea was to that Saudis
Would be preferred over foreigners.
Saudis should be preferred over, and this was really complicated because for many years Saudis did not want to hold these jobs.
Because of economic reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
I was raising that earlier. Perhaps it's not just the campaign, but because of the present economic status of that campaign.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely not just because of the campaign. But I mean, these things are often complicated, and it was the campaign, and it was at the right time, and there was a forward-looking Minister of Labor, and all these things kind of came together, and he was able to say, look, women campaigning, you know, high unemployment, especially high female unemployment, you know, Saudization. It was just a few things kind of came together and made it possible to make this change.
You know for a fact that there are so many Filipinos working there in the household, in the oil household. They can really see women in bikinis.
I'm sorry, you were saying what?
They can see women in bikinis.
Sure, and it's really uncomfortable to say, but it's because they're considered that they don't quite count in the same way. Or, you know, they're not seen as, it's not the same as if a Saudi man would see them. It's really, it raises some really, you know, difficult questions. And that wasn't the focus of my reporting ever. You know, I've been looking at these broader economic issues. I don't think I would get a visa. This is something we're going to talk about in the reporting workshop, is getting permission to report the story you want to report, which is a huge issue. There's no way I would get permission to report on like relationships with it. Yeah, but it's something I talk to Saudi friends about a lot.
Yeah. Of course, we have to present all the facts.
Yeah, of course.
We have to balance things out, you know.
I mean, one thing I would love to report, which I'll never get permission to, you know, is the number of foreign women in prisons on death row in Saudi Arabia. Witchcraft accusations are a sort of big way, you know, sort of getting revenge on your maid if you don't want to pay her. Maybe she starts complaining about the fact that you haven't paid her salary in a year and a half and you took away her passport. Well, why don't you find some little object in her room from her home country? And you know, and this witchcraft is something the Saudi government takes incredibly seriously. They've got, there's actually a dedicated witchcraft squad on the police force, and they've been building it up in recent years. They've got these sort of 12 government agency witchcraft seminars, and you know, you see out there are witchcraft hotlines where you can report your neighbors anonymously with tips. I'm sorry?
Yeah, you can accuse your maid of stealing.
Well, I mean, you can accuse anyone, but the numbers. The people that are most likely to suffer in practice tend to be the foreign servants, yes. I mean, this is a story that I would love to report, which I would never in a million years get permission to report, but the proportion of foreigners in Saudi prisons, and especially on death row in the kingdom, it's really overwhelming. You're much more likely as a vulnerable foreigner to be accused.
Or the conditions of workers' camps and things like that.
Yeah, yes. It's sort of, there's a little less of that than you see in the Emirates and the other Gulf countries, but yes, that's a good point as well. And there has been, and that's another difficult thing to report on. There has been some, but it's really, really tricky.